Hi, welcome everybody. Hi,
Hi.
Andrea.
Good to see you again.
Good to see you. We are back with another episode of Lights, How to Talk to Kids About Human Trafficking. My name is Liz Radzicki. I am an education specialist with Participate, Inc., and I'm joined by Andrea.
Hi. Hi, I'm Andrea Powell, and I am the Director of Survivor and Youth Engagement for Unitas, and we work to prevent trafficking of youth through educating parents, like today, teachers, caretakers, law enforcement, basically frontline responders with the goal of keeping kids safe. And we also go inside schools and other youth programs to talk to youth directly about the issue of human trafficking. And collectively, as a team, we've reached upwards of 25,000 youth by educating them about the issue of trafficking in schools and in their communities. So excited to be here today for the next episode, Liz.
Great. Well, today we are focusing, the name of the episode is Know the Laws. And so we're focusing, we're going to take some time to talk about the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000 and some of the subsequent amendments and additions to that. And then also some other laws and policies that we may not think of as being directly related to trafficking as well. Before we dive in, Andrea, if you wouldn't mind giving us your definition of human trafficking for folks who are joining us for the first time.
Sure, absolutely. So human trafficking at its core is about someone or a group of people being vulnerable, and on the other side, someone willing to exploit that vulnerability. So for the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which was passed in 2000, and we're going to talk about conceptually how people have changed their framework of what trafficking looks like in the US since that time. But starting with the TVPA, the definition is that anyone who's induced to commit a commercial sex act through force, fraud, or coercion who's over the age of 18 is considered to be a victim of sex trafficking. Anyone under 18 is considered to be a victim of sex trafficking if they're involved in a commercial sex act, regardless of whether or not they were forced, frauded, or coerced. So that can mean, for example, a 15-year-old girl or boy who's saying, I love this person, this is my boyfriend, this is my girlfriend, I'm doing this for us. And ultimately, as much as we want youth to have agency, it doesn't matter. They're still considered legally a victim of sex trafficking. On the other side is labor trafficking. And for everyone involved, you have to prove force, fraud, and coercion if you are alleging to be a victim of labor trafficking, which is basically any type of goods or service or any type of labor. So it can be agriculture, domestic servitude. These are some of the top forms of labor exploitation. Oftentimes there's a misconception that you have to be a foreign national to be a victim of trafficking, but both for sex trafficking and for labor trafficking, you can be a foreign national, you can be here on legal immigration papers, you can be a US citizen. In fact, the vast majority of victims of trafficking in the United States are in fact US citizens. So that's sort of a fly by the seat of your pants version of what trafficking looks like from a legal definitional framework.
And from what I know about the Trafficking Victims Protection Act is a lot of what it did was to define those terms, right? And to define. So let's jump into it. Can you talk a little bit about sort of that act and some of the other laws that have come out about?
Okay, here we go. So the Trafficking Victims Protection Act was passed in the year 2000. It was a seminal bill that was a federal landmark bill to define what trafficking is. And I just gave basically the definition that was defined. But here's something interesting to point out. At the time that bill was written and conceptualized, it was truly groundbreaking and innovative. However, at that time, the vast majority of people in the US, including lawmakers, policymakers, and advocates, believed that trafficking was by and large an issue that was impacting foreign nationals entering into the United States as victims of trafficking. It did not necessarily look at, for example, foreign nationals who came into this country either through legal ports of entry or through smuggling as potentially victims of trafficking if they chose to come in illegally and then subsequently were trafficked later down the road. It didn't necessarily conceptualize that. It also did not provide broad protections for example, US kids. It did not necessarily look at US citizens in the same way. It's not that they were necessarily excluded, but a lot of the provisions around relief, for example, to get a T visa, or continued presence, which means you can stay in the country, or if you have a close family, mom, dad, children, being able to bring them into the country as what's called derivatives under a T visa. So all of these protections, by and large, were designed for foreign nationals, but there was not a lot of protection or allocation of services for U.S. citizens, for shelters, for addressing runaway and homeless youth, for addressing, U.S. citizens who also need financial support after they've been trafficked, because, again, traffickers are exploiting individuals because they're vulnerable. And so those vulnerabilities, be it prior sexual abuse, be it because of your gender orientation, be it because you're a victim of domestic violence and you fled home and there's no shelters and someone approaches you, on and on it goes. Those individuals also had everything taken from them, and all those pre-existing vulnerabilities are still there after trafficking. But this bill, as great as it was, didn't necessarily address a lot of those nuances. So you started.
Yes. Can I ask a question about sort of how that definition changed before we move on? Which is like, I guess my question is sort of why was the definition of trafficking so limited? And what moved it? Like what kind of allowed that to move and to broaden, to become more inclusive of other forms of trafficking?
So the first part, again, I just think that people didn't understand trafficking to be bigger than what was conceptually like modern day slavery. So trafficking is often equated to modern day slavery, but that sometimes narrows the focus in and doesn't look at some of the risk factors that people might be facing, doesn't necessarily look at some elements of force, fraud, and coercion that are a lot harder to look at, particularly when we're talking about like economic coercion, psychological coercion. So this bill didn't necessarily look at that framework broadly. However, when talking about how is it changing and how have we, conceptually changed it, I should probably note that I'm not a lawyer, but I'm a very annoying advocate, and I've been an annoying advocate for about 15 years. So I'm speaking from that lens. But as an annoying advocate, I annoyed many lawmakers on various issues, along with coworkers from advocacy groups and direct service providers and survivors. It's critical to note that survivors themselves have played a phenomenal role in being the experts that they are, and really educating the public, educating lawmakers, educating the media on what trafficking actually means from their life experience and what they think needs to be done to either prevent it or to actually provide protection and services. So I wanted to fast forward a little bit, actually a lot of it, because there's been a lot of progress in the last 5 to 6 years. So in 2009, the state of New York was the first state that said, okay, we've noticed that there are a lot of kids being arrested for prostitution and being arrested for solicitation, and they're being locked up and they're being treated as criminals. This is not consistent with how the Trafficking Victims Protection Act defined the issue of trafficking. So what was happening is, even though kids federally were being defined as victims of sex trafficking if they were induced to commit a commercial sex act and were under 18, that didn't mean they weren't being arrested. In fact, in 2009, there was upwards of 1,000 kids a year nationally being arrested for solicitation and prostitution. Not to mention the fact that there were a lot of kids who were also being arrested for things called status offenses, which is basically like curfew violations. I did a little digging on some of the numbers, and in 2018, there were still 260 kids arrested federally for prostitution, solicitation, and there were 22,000 kids arrested for status offenses. The reason that's important and why I'm getting into that is because a lot of these kids who are arrested for running away, for not showing up to court for a family matter, for curfew violation, truancy, a lot of these kids are actually at risk or have experienced trafficking. And so this bill in the state of New York in 2009 started to recognize these inconsistencies and seeing how these kids were being swept up in the criminal justice system, but not treated as victims. So it actually provided immunity for children who were under the age of 16 for their first offense, to allow them to get services and support and programs. So it was a very limited scope bill. And again, I want to note that there were a lot of advocates who were survivors in the state of New York working with different organizations to make that bill possible. But what's had to happen since then, which can be a bit of a head-banging experience for an advocate, but you're going state by state by state, trying to basically correct the inconsistencies with state law with that of the federal Trafficking Victims Protection Act. So I will give an example from the District of Columbia, which is where I've been for quite some time. With the District of Columbia in 2014, advocacy groups and survivors joined together with other state legislators to put together a bill that would go through the District of Columbia City Council, because we are a strange jurisdiction. But that was the direction we were going. And our goal was to have full immunity for children who are involved in any form of commercial sex, to provide increased services, as well as to ensure that law enforcement were trained and understood how to identify victims of trafficking and then refer these kids to appropriate services. It also allowed for us to align ourselves with the District of Columbia to make sure that children who are victims of sex trafficking or any form of trafficking are considered victims of child abuse. Now, that kind of makes common sense, but the reason that that's important is it has to be identified as child abuse in order for Child Protective Services to investigate what's going on with that child. Otherwise, what you're looking at is that they're only investigating allegations against the guardian. But when you broaden the scope to say all child trafficking is a form of child abuse, which was a part of a piece of legislation that passed in 2015 on the federal side, which I will get into. But we were aligning ourselves with the District of Columbia to be more consistent with those laws. And when that bill passed, technically in 2014, but was signed into law by our mayor in 2015, that allowed for increased services. It allowed for a pathway to a lot of new programming. It did not, unfortunately, allow for funding. So as service providers, myself included, that meant that basically our caseload tripled and funding did not. And that is pretty much an issue with pretty much all legislation. But I think it's really important to note that it did allow for kids who previously were being locked up and not evaluated to then get evaluated for potentially being involved in trafficking. And it also created this pathway that led to the opening of a new court program in the District of Columbia that would look at kids who were at risk or experiencing trafficking as victims and allow for their case to be adjudicated, which means charges dismissed. It ensured that they got access to services and programs like ours. And it also ensured that those who were working kind of as their multidisciplinary team, the probation officer, the police officers, their defense attorney, the judge, would all come together to be a team for this kid. So it's not an adversarial space. In fact, it's so welcoming that we even have a service dog, and the judge gets off the bench, which usually scares the kids a little bit in the beginning, but then they see that she's there to help them and support them. So that example for the District of Columbia is similar to what you're seeing in states all across the country. So that's one thing that I think is really important for people to understand is kids are now more and more being viewed as victims. I don't really think I'm going to get too much into what's happening with adults today, but that could certainly be a whole separate conversation, because I wanted to shift to a couple of other things, but maybe pause and make sure I didn't just freak you out with a whole bunch of information and see if there's any questions.
Yeah, if folks are watching, live, please post questions in the comments section, and we can try to address those as they come up. So I just want to kind of repeat back what I heard. Again, I'm a proxy learner here, so I'm kind of, so a shift in the law was really impactful because it changed how these cases were treated, and it went from just being prosecution, punitive toward the offender, and more supportive and service-driven towards the victims.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
I wanted to point out, and this is where I feel like oftentimes that, I often say a good piece of legislation is the one where nobody's completely happy, because there's always opposition. There's always people saying we shouldn't do this. So for example, with not allowing law enforcement to arrest kids on prostitution and solicitation, there was this fear, right? Particularly with law enforcement of, okay, I've got this kid, they're sitting in front of me, I want to get them off the street. I see that they're being victimized. I see they're being trafficked. I don't have anywhere for them to go. There's no shelter in this community for these children. There's not appropriate services. They'll just run away if I put them, in a foster group home. So do I leave them on the street to be basically raped and exploited? Or do I arrest them and basically upset them and traumatize them through this arrest, but I get them off the street? So that's sort of that was the fear, and that's somewhat of an impossible position to put law enforcement in. Not to say there's lots of times that law enforcement have arrested kids and not had that sort of deep reflective thought process going on, but many do, and I've worked with them. And so it's important to note that these pieces of legislation really should involve support and funding for communities and service providers to make sure that these kids have an opportunity for services and support, and because we don't want jail to be a shelter. It's not therapeutic to be in jail. Nobody goes in there and says, you know what, all my life problems were healed while I was sitting in this jail cell. Just probably not. So that's why it's important to note that we need to include funding and support. And I wanted to shift a little bit into something that is very, I think, important for people who are listening to think about for their community and for their state. But thinking about like what our ultimate goal is at Unitas is we want to prevent trafficking. And so we've been very interested, even though we're not necessarily a policy organization, in legislation on a state or federal level that would require communities and schools to educate kids about the issue of trafficking. And that would be in schools, that would be at different ages, that could be through community organizations, it could be through school districts, but that's where we've been on the forefront of really pushing to make sure that all kids, because oftentimes kids are, put into boxes like you're at risk, you're not at risk. But with a global pandemic and all kids at home and parents struggling, risks are changing and evolving. And it's really important that all kids are educated. And so a pathway to do that is to make sure that there's legislation that supports that. The state of Maryland actually did pass, for example, prevention education language, and they passed a bill that required schools to educate kids about trafficking. Unfortunately, there was no funding attached. And at one point, my organization that I previously was with realized that we were in fact fulfilling that state mandate on our own as a nonprofit. So that there needs to be more coordinated support to do this, to make sure that the information is consistent, and also to make sure, okay, you walk into a classroom, you're talking to a group of kids, there's a very good chance that there's going to be a kid asking for support and services. And it could be about trafficking, it could be about child abuse, it could be about some of those core risk factors that are like the cake that's underneath that bad icing of trafficking. So that's another area of legislation that's starting to trend forward. There are some federal efforts right now to make sure that that trafficking prevention is mandated. But again, if it's on a federal level, you have to go back state by state, and states have to pass their legislation as well. So you have the protective work around safe harbor bills, which is kind of like the broad term for them, and you have the more preventative focused bills, and then there's also additional bills that are looking to correct violations, basically, or to correct false arrests. So victims of trafficking who are adults oftentimes have a solicitation, prostitution, curfew, a variety of criminal charges that sit on their records that make it really hard for them to get access to their kids, if they have kids, get access to federal housing programs, even go to college. I had a young survivor who at 18 was arrested for prostitution in Washington State. And fast forward 3 years, she's helped put away 11 traffickers. She testified in a big federal case. She was doing advocacy work, had spoken like all over the world. I mean, just was really rocking and rolling, decided she wanted to go to college. So she applied to a state school and got a scholarship. And at the last minute, they revoked her scholarship because she was had a criminal record, and that criminal record involved what was considered a sex crime. So states started to recognize this, and advocacy groups and survivors banded together both on the federal level as well as on a state by state level to start to pass bills that would basically vacate those charges for someone who had charges that are a result of their trafficking. Certain charges are excluded that are considered violent crimes. And that sometimes can be a big problem, because sometimes violent crime can be like 3 strikes you're out with, say, marijuana. Violent crime is kind of a broad term, but again, in the District of Columbia, we had a really interesting experience in that we had a federal bill that we were advocating for as a community of advocates. And the idea, again, was that if you're a victim of trafficking and your trafficker forced you into committing a crime, you should have your record vacated. But it's pretty nuanced and complicated. The federal bill kind of stagnated through policymakers on different sides of the aisle disagreeing on what a violent crime is predominantly. But on the district level, we were able to pass the bill relatively quickly. The state of Maryland also has similar legislation, and more states are passing these bills. So I guess that, having those 3 areas of protecting kids who are being exploited, making sure those who were exploited actually have access to vacatur and services, and then finally kind of looping back around, wouldn't it be nice if there was no trafficking at all? And part of the pathway to get there is educating kids and parents and lawmakers and pretty much everyone on the front lines. And so that's kind of where we're at. And backing up a little bit, because I know we probably have a couple of questions before we close. We started with this idea, this piece of legislation, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, saying this is what trafficking is to us. But today we're seeing that we have to expand some of that framework so that we're keeping all kids safe from exploitation and trafficking. And that's why we're starting to look at, for example, pieces of legislation that address online exploitation. There is a very controversial bill called FOSTA SESTA that was passed in March of 2018 that was basically a product of 10 years of advocacy. I once made a document of all the different advocacy things I was involved in with that piece of legislation. It was 27 pages of just links, not text, just links. It really is a huge effort. But it's still controversial because the bill basically says that online publishers, so for example, Facebook, Craigslist, places like that, if they knowingly or willfully facilitate sex trafficking on their website, then they are liable and they're no longer protected through a piece of legislation passed in 1996 when the internet was like a baby, called the Communications Decency Act. So we're constantly having to evolve what trafficking looks like and address that on a policy level so that we can keep everyone who is victimized protected, but also so that we can better prevent and be proactive. And I think a lot of legislation right now is on the proactive side, including safe harbor.
In the 5 minutes that we have left, I'm wondering, so I think I have 2 big questions. So one is sort of around what are some of the connected policies that might not immediately come to mind, but that also make a big impact in terms of either helping survivors that without being explicitly about helping survivors, but also about mitigating vulnerabilities. So what are some policies that are sort of around those things? And then my second sort of bucket question is, how can we be also annoying advocates, to use your term? How can we join you in being annoying advocates for the kind of policy and legislation that we need to prevent trafficking?
So to start with your first question, Liz, basically, there's a couple of areas that I think I'm going to point out. There are others, but one is around runaway and homeless youth. There's a piece of legislation that's in fact called the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act, and it gets reauthorized every so often. And there's always lots of fights around what kind of funding can be attached to it, who should be trained. But basically, this bill ensures that youth have access to a hotline, that they have access to services. And I can say 80% of survivors I've known and worked with, and I've worked with about 1,500 survivors, about 80% were homeless prior to being trafficked. So not just during a trafficking situation, but prior. So providing quality, safe shelter and housing opportunities for youth who can't stay at home is critical. And I want to say something that gets kind of in the weeds, but we often use this term runaway, and I really don't like this word, because when you have a child who's either witnessing violence at home, who's either being bullied at school, no one's offering them services. They are isolated, alone, scared, or being abused, and they decide to leave home. They didn't run away. Society pushed them away. And I think that thinking of these kids as being pushed away is a critical lens framework shift that has to happen in order for us to stop putting the blame and the action on the child and start looking at what are we doing as a community to bring this child back in and keep them safe. So that's a piece of legislation that does that. Another area that people often don't think of is after school programming and funding for education and funding for schools to provide meals, to provide, basic things for kids, getting them access to counseling in the schools. So basically looking at the school as a community, legislation that does that is helping prevent trafficking, even though it's not explicitly stating that, because so many kids will say, I was just hungry and this guy offered me food and I got in his car and things kind of evolved from there. Or I was feeling isolated and bullied at school and then I was sitting at home online and this girl messaged me and we started chatting and exchanging photos, and now I'm being exploited because I'm too scared of whether or not they're going to expose those photos through what we talked about earlier called sextortion. So bills that focus on youth who can't stay at home and bills that focus on what they can do to keep kids safe in their school community are really critical. And then how to become an annoying advocate. I often joke that overstepping is one of my primary modes of transportation. But it's really educating yourself about, is there prevention education legislation in your community? Does your state or your city still arrest children for solicitation and prostitution? Are people who are victims of trafficking still being left with the black eye of arrests on their records so that they're not able to get access to housing and programs? What are your schools doing to provide meals for kids? So it's identifying an issue that resonates with you, right? Because if you're not passionate, it's not going to work. And then finding advocacy groups or legislators who you can either join or letters that you can write. You can also look at Unitas's materials and figure out, what are other areas that you're passionate about. And I know we're going to be talking a little bit more about what people can do in an upcoming episode. But I really think it's important to look and see, those core areas around prevention, around protection for kids, and then finding groups or reaching out individually to your lawmakers to say, like, this matters to me, because they definitely want to listen to you if especially if you bother them every day.
Well, and it sounds like too, the other thing that I got from just hearing about, especially the role of survivors in advocacy and getting policies built, is like just the power of storytelling. And especially around that nuance that you were talking about of it's not just this, it's this and this and this, and these are all the factors that lead to it. So I think that's huge. But yeah, I am. Thank you for the advice on how to be an annoying advocate.
Sure.
And I think that point that you're making about finding the thing that matters to you. So when the second you said after school programming, I was like, yes, that was my life for so long, was after school programs. Yes. And so like, if that's a way that I can, use my expertise and my knowledge about that issue to impact this other issue that matters to me, that's awesome advice. And so I want to give a plug to our next episode on the 23rd, which is about what can I do? And so we what we're asking folks to do is kind of send in your situation. What's your role? Like, what's your network? What's your job? What's your community? And let us know what those are. And then Andrea is going to help us think about, like, okay, if I don't know why this is coming to mind, but this is coming to mind. I'm a dentist. How can I, as a dentist, make a difference in human trafficking? And so we want to get really specific. We want a lot of people to join the live chat or to send us things in advance. And so this is our plug for September 23rd for that episode. But Andrea, thank you so much. As always, I've learned so much. I have so many things that I'm thinking about, so many takeaways with me, but thank you so much for everyone who joined us live. And this will be available as a recording.
Yes, definitely. It'll be
forever.
Yes. Thanks so much, Liz. I'll talk to you soon. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everybody.